So welcome all to our monthly discussion here with the Juris North. Today we have the pleasure from Italy to have Gürkan Çapar from Sant'Anna School of Advanced Studies in Pisa, Italy. He will be talking about his working paper, reading the PSPP judgment through the perspective of rules. Gürkan, thank you very much. Gürkan is originally from Turkey, and again, he's doing his PhD here in Pisa. Welcome here to Juris North, Gürkan.
Thank you, Jorge, for having me here. Also, I would like to thank everyone for being here and listening to me. Okay, I have a presentation. I will share my slides right now.
Yeah, it's working. Yeah.
Okay. The title of my presentation is Reading the PSPP Judgment Through the Perspective of Rules. As you all know, in the last year, in the 5th of May, the Bundesverfassungsgericht found the judgment of Court of Justice in PSPP ultra vires and stated that this judgment has no binding effect in Germany. Of course, this was a shocking decision, and many scholars focused on the autonomy and supremacy of EU law and criticized the judgment on the grounds that it runs counter to the principles of rule of law. Also, some scholars focused on proportionality analysis and the discussion between Bundesverfassungsgericht and European Court of Justice, particularly the balancing step of proportionality analysis, because Bundesverfassungsgericht insisted on using balancing also as part of proportionality analysis, whereas European Court of Justice generally avoids using balancing in proportionality analysis and grants certain margin of appreciation to the member states and other EU institutions. Also, the judgment is criticized because of its timing. Because the EU has already an ongoing rule of law crisis, and lots of scholars was of the opinion that it may help the autocratic leaders, and the other captured courts may use this judgment as a pretext in the upcoming days. However, I will not focus this part in this paper. And I would like to focus on how rules help us to allocate authority and how they are used while authority is allocated between different institutions. In doing so, I will not focus on proportionality analysis and principles, because in also Alexian scholars, among Alexian scholars, there is an ongoing discussion about formal principles and how to explain discretion while using principles and weight formula and balancing formula. But I will not also focus this part. And I will directly deal with the function of rules and how they allocate authority by benefiting from the concept of authority and Ross-Service conception of authority. First of all, let's look at the decision. I think the decision is a perfect example of a recent phenomenon called procedural proportionality review. According to substantive proportionality review, this is a general type of judicial review, in fact, because the court just strike a balance between two competing fundamental rights or principles and reach a decision. But in procedural proportionality review, the reviewing court look at how the reviewed court or the other institutional authority implemented proportionality analysis. So the last instance court does not engage in a balancing exercise itself, and investigates the way proportionality analysis is implemented by the other reviewed authority. And there's an excerpt here of the Bundesverfassungsgericht in PSPP, and the court explicitly states that it is not for the Federal Constitutional Court to substitute the Court of Justice interpretation with its own, as long as the Court of Justice applies recognized methodological principles and the decision it renders is not arbitrary from an objective perspective. The Federal Constitutional Court must respect the decision of the Court of Justice, even when it adopts a view against which weight argument could be made. The interpretation and application of the treaties necessarily entails that the Court of Justice be granted a certain margin of error. So the Bundesverfassungsgericht just look at the way the Court of Justice applied the proportionality analysis and implement the proportionality analysis rather than insisting on one right answer. So we may say that it is a procedural proportionality review. Before dealing with theoretical issues, let's have a look at the positive law of the EU and see how rules are allocated in the EU legal order. As you all know, there are some competences exclusively conferred to member states. The others are exclusively conferred to EU institutions, and there are also some shared competences. And they are all just enshrined in Article 5 of the TEU. And according to Article 5 of the TEU, the limits of union competences are governed by the principle of conferral. The use of union competences is governed by the principles of subsidiarity and proportionality. Under the principle of conferral, the union shall act only within the limits of competences conferred upon it by the member states in the treaties to attain the objectives set out therein. Competences not conferred upon the union in the treaties remain within the member states. Under the principle of proportionality, the content and form of the union action shall not exceed what is necessary to achieve the objectives of the treaties. So, as you see, there is this principle of conferral, and this principle of conferral is also subject to principle of proportionality. What does it mean? The EU, while using its competences, should apply proportionality analysis and should follow the principle of proportionality. So it is not only restricted with principle of conferral, but it's also subject to a principle of proportionality. And in the section 4 of Article 5, you can see the principle of proportionality, and here the necessary part, the necessity step is exclusively stipulated. So some authors argue that proportionality analysis should be applied in a restrictive way and should only include suitability and necessity steps rather than extending to balancing step, because balancing step is the most robust one and most restrictive one in some sense. So lots of authors argue that Bundesverfassungsgericht should not insist on using balancing step and should stop at the necessity step by benefiting from Article 5 of TEU, Section 4. Also, when it comes to PSPP, as you all know, PSPP is a regulation about monetary policies, and that's why there is a discussion about whether it is on the monetary policy or it also extends to economic policies, because monetary policies is under the exclusive competences of the EU, but economic policies are exclusive competences of the member state. But the question is that how to differ monetary policy from economic policy? Of course, there are some criteria stipulated in Article 127 of the TEU. Also, European Central Bank try to concretize this abstract idea, what monetary policy is. But there are some different theorems about it. On the one hand, there is this idea defined by the Court of Justice. It is impossible to differentiate monetary policy and economic policy clearly, so it is enough to prioritize financial stability. So if you cannot separate clearly monetary policy from economic policy, so European Court of Justice or European Central Bank will have much more margin of appreciation or much more latitude while giving a decision about what economic policy or monetary policy is. On the other hand, Bundesverfassungsgericht argue that we can separate them and it should be separated. And they argue that a measure cannot be qualified as one of monetary policy unless it directly pursues monetary policy objectives. So, for example, let's think about a regulation. It indirectly pursues a monetary policy. In that case, it will not be a monetary policy according to Bundesverfassungsgericht. But the core of the decision or PSPP judgment is this tension, how to differ monetary policy from economic policy. And we can think both of them as principles in Alexian sense, and we will also deal with this issue substantively in the later part. But in any case, what I try to emphasize is the following. These are, before the content of the rules, we have some kind of rules. Article 3 of TEU or Article 5 TEU, these are rules in some sense, and they are also allocating authority, and they are saying that they are stating that these competences are under the exclusive competences of EU or member states. And I would like to focus the importance of these rules while allocating horizontal authority. So, as I said, no need to exclusively focus on the question of how to use proportionality analysis, because it will lead us to ask the question whether it necessitates balancing step or not. Because on the one hand, some scholars argue that balancing step should be included in proportionality analysis. The others are defending the contrary view. So there is no, it leads us to a deadlock, and there is no a definite answer to this question. And there is also another problem here. Proportionality analysis is developed for balancing fundamental rights. But here we don't have fundamental rights. These are competences. And from here arises another question, whether these competences are fundamental rights or not, whether we can conceptualize them as fundamental rights. These are all problems. And for me, at least, we can think these power conferring norms or competences more like rules, because if they are principles, there will always be a debate whether these competences fall under EU institutions or member state institutions. So the basic function of law to provide stability and to solve the problem of coordination will all collapse in this kind of a situation. So let's focus on the rule itself, allocating power instead of content. Because we have already rules allocating authority between the EU and member states. It is true that competences are framed in an inconclusive way, and it's hard to determine ex ante what counts as monetary and economic policies. Yet this doesn't undercut the value of rules in the first instance. Then the question arises, how do rules allocate authority? Of course, there are some ways how rules allocate authority. The first one is if we have a higher order rule that allocating authority, of course, like rule of recognition or Grun norm, of course, this will solve all the problems. But this will solve all the problems in a monist legal order. And if we have a last instance court stating explicitly what the rule is. But in EU legal order, we don't have a last instance court, and the existence of last instance court is a matter of dispute in the EU legal order. So it is really hard to say that at least our EU constitution could provide a sufficient answer to the question of which institution is the latest institution. That's why we have some debates about competences, and we have also a trend of constitutional pluralism. And lots of scholars argue that it is better to leave the question unanswered rather than providing an answer in terms of constitutionalism or basic principles of constitutionalism. Anyway, this is one solution, to have a higher order rule. Another solution may be, in the absence of a rule, using balancing as a method. But we can only use balancing as a method if we have a background, political morality or understanding in the Dworkinian sense. If we have a legal system, of course, we can use balancing. For example, also in filling gaps, when we just think legal gaps, we fill these gaps because we have a background morality or we have a legal system, so we can just use interpretive methodologies or systemic interpretation or teleological interpretation to use this kind of, to fill this kind of gaps. So if we don't have a unitary or quasi-integrated legal regime, it will be impossible to use balancing. So I will come, what I try to say, if we approach this question from the perspective of rules, we can show that balancing is not the only way to find a solution to this kind of problems, because there is a general tendency in these days that lots of scholars arguing that, okay, it is good to use balancing to fill these gaps, but we don't always need balancing, because in the first instance, we have rules. And if we have rules, maybe dealing with the concept of rule, maybe we can just find another solution. As I said, in the EU, the problem is not the absence of a rule, but the plurality of primary institutions and law-applying institutions. In this case, it is plausible to argue that no need to confine our analysis to monistic account of Raz and his service conception. And Nicole Rauchan, in his book written in 2013, explicitly mentions about relative understanding of authority or pluralistic conception of authority. And I think it is an easy way, because if we just follow Rauchan's pluralistic understanding of authority, it is so easy to defend the PSPP judgment or the position of Bundesverfassung Gericht, because it is one of the requirements of plurality. But I think we don't need to go this way. We can still explain PSPP judgment by using Raz service conception authority, which is designed for monistic legal orders. So in the following part, I will try to provide a justification of the PSPP judgment, even from the perspective of Raz monistic account, by showing how rules allocate authority between institutions and focusing on interinstitutional relationships. And I will also argue that, in fact, this is not a novel phenomenon, because when we just think about the relationship between legislature and judiciary, between different higher courts, in the absence of a Supreme Court, because, for example, in France, there is Conseil d'État and Conseil Constitutionnel, and they have also different competences. There is no last instance court. There is always this kind of a tension between different institutions, in fact, even in these monistic legal orders. So there's always a plurality of institutions and authorities that are collectively responsible against individuals and subjects. Let's turn our attention to the rules and their functions. If we just categorize practical reasoning in broad stroke, two different types. One of them is particularistic decision making or practical reasoning. We can just think it like all things considered practical reasoning. Normal times, we generally use this kind of practical reasoning, because when we are just trying to decide something, in the absence of rules, we take into account all the important variables, and we are just trying to reach a decision by using our practical reasoning and ask the question, what should I do in that situation? But rules change our practical reasoning significantly, because when rules come to the scene, we obey the rules even they are against our practical reasoning. Because, for example, just think about a situation. We have when we are in front of a traffic light, and when we are just prepared to pass across, and we just look at the traffic light, and if we just saw the green light, we pass. This is the rule. If it is red, we just stop there, even if there is no other car around there, because this is the rule. But in our normal practical reasoning, in an all things considered judgment, we will probably look at our right and left, and if there is no car around, we will probably pass, because in the absence of a rule, this will be the normal way of practical reasoning. So rules change our practical reasoning and decision making. And Raz service conception of authority is one of the fundamental explanation of how rules function in our practical reasoning. Rules function as exclusionary reasons. They exclude some reasons in our practical reasoning, and they limit our practical reasoning. But they does it in our favor, because we cannot live by thinking or considering all the things always in our lives. We need rules because they make our lives easier. Because, for example, in every kind of situation, if we just look at, if we just try to give the best decision, it will not always be the best decision. Anyway, the problems coming with the rules are twofold. One of of them is about outcome-based, the other is autonomy-based. Outcome-based problem is the following. They just limit, they may not always lead the best outcome, because sometimes when following the rules, it may lead to injustice or these kind of situations or worse outcomes. Also, it infringes our autonomy, because rather than believing or following our own practical reasoning, we are just following the rules. But this is what we need, why we need rules, because they help us to confirm our underlying reasons. This is what Raz called indirect strategy of conformity, maximizing conformity with reasons, not by trying to comply with them, but by following someone else's judgment about what one should do. So rules help us to overcome our cognitive biases by cutting off the tie between deliberation and execution. We need rules not because they provide clarity and bring issues to the table, but because they take things off the table. They are time and labor-saving devices because they simplify our practical reasoning and make our lives easier. They have agenda simplifying and desk clearing function, so on and so forth. And there are three theses of Raz while explaining rules and authority, because Raz service conception of authority, Raz thinks rules as authority, because they are authoritative decision-making tools. There are three theses of Raz. One of them is preemption thesis. They preempt our practical reasoning. Of course, this is also still a matter of dispute whether they prevent reason for decision, or deliberative skills, or they only prevent reason for action. No need to deal with this part right now. The second one is normal justification thesis. The rules should provide us a service. This is why we obey rules. This is the underlying idea of normal justification thesis. And dependency thesis is the following: rules depend on the underlying reasons, depend on the reasons that we have already. Because, for example, if we just want to forbid smoking cigarettes, the main reason of forbid this ban is to help people in a lively environment, or maybe to make people live in a more healthier way. So the underlying reason is to maintain or to live healthily. And the reason of the ban is these underlying reasons. So there should be a correlation between underlying reasons and rules. So rules rest on the shoulders of background or underlying reasons. This is also called justifications. But rules are opaque and intransparent. They do not show their background reasons. For example, no dogs allowed in the restaurant is a rule, and the justification or background reason of it may be to maintain a quiet and welcoming environment. And should a very small dog without any ability to bark be allowed to the restaurant? So the question is, can we pierce the veil of opaqueness under certain circumstances? And there are two different ways to follow here. On the one hand, we can say that preemption thesis should be interpreted strictly, so they exclude not only action but also deliberation. So we shouldn't allow this dog. Also, we can just interpret it in a wide way, and we can say that, okay, under some circumstances, we should go beyond the rule and question its telos, its main understanding or its main function, or we can think rules as weightier reasons, and they do not exclude our deliberation, but only exclude action. We can still deliberate, think, and weight the other reasons, non-excluded reasons with the rules, and reach a decision. And these are the way followed by Michael Moore, Stephen Perry, Frederick Schauer, also Rodriguez Blanco recently followed this kind of a path, which is which she benefits from Aristotelian understanding of good making characteristic of rules. And I will ask the question whether there is another way to tertium datur, and for me, yes. As I said, there is a normative gap between rules and background reasons. So they exclude action. They also exclude substantive deliberation, but they do not exclude procedural deliberation. What I mean with procedural deliberation? First of all, to obey a rule, we need to accept that there's a rule. So whether this rule is a question of a procedural question, and I will call it a procedural deliberation. In Rust service conception of authority, Rust gives some examples of normal justification thesis and some examples. For example, according to Rust, normal justification thesis is piecemeal and context specific. There is no general obligation to obey the law. So authority should be justified in each concrete situation. If authority is justified in each concrete situation, then preemption thesis is not that preventive, in fact. So it is only piecemeal. Yeah, if we can just think normal justification and preemptive thesis together. So if in each and every concrete situation, if authority is to be justified, then we can say that there is no authority, because it is so limited authority, it should be justified every time. There is no general obligation to obey the law. So this is one of the reasons that we can say that, in fact, the preemptive thesis is not that preemptive. So there is another issue. Every rule has a scope. As I said, there is dependency thesis, and every rule depends some underlying and background reasons that we already have. So there are some non-excluded reasons with every rule. So if there are some unexcluded reasons, we should question whether this rule includes some unexcluded reasons. We can just think here PSPP judgment. The EU should use its competences only and should decide according to its competences. If EU use some competences that is not conferred to EU, this will be ultra vires. And at least to question whether it is EU is using its own competences is a question of whether there are any unexcluded reasons at stake or not. Also, there is another issue. Contrary to substantive mistakes, jurisdictional mistakes are essential in legal obligation. So, also in domestic legal orders, we don't obey the rules that is given outside some certain jurisdictions. So, in any case, the Bundesverfassung Gericht's questioning of whether European Court of Justice is obeying its own jurisdictional limits is still legitimate from the perspective of service conception of authority. Also, when it comes to substantive issue, rules may be overridden under the conditions of extreme injustice or iniquitous discrimination. So there are some really extreme injustices, maybe may follow from some regulations of the authority, and it may not be justified. So in these conditions, rule or authority will not provide its normal justification function. Justification of authority is always problematic, particularly from the perspective of autonomy. So any theory about rules should deal with the problem of justification of authority. There's always this tension between authority and autonomy, because whenever we use authority, we will infringe individual autonomy. And Rust's service conception of authority also stays on this kind of a tension between preemption thesis and normal justification thesis. However, Rust chooses a functional and outcome-based of justification of authority. Authority is legitimate as long as it provides its service-providing function. As I said, there can be three ways to follow here. Substantive deliberation thesis considers rule as weighty reasons. No deliberation thesis, authority excludes deliberation. But I argue that we can just follow another path, and this is the procedural deliberation thesis. It excludes only substantive deliberation, but whether authority is used within the jurisdictional boundaries or other exceptional considerations are at stake in the issue is another question, and this is a procedural question which cannot be taken from any kind of individual when they are in front of an authoritative rule. So we need to mirror up preemption thesis with normal justification thesis. And while doing so, as I said, there may be three different ways, and I'm defining a procedural deliberation thesis. And while doing so, I argue that there is, in fact, a scope-based discordance between preemption thesis and normal justification thesis. Because preemption thesis is, in fact, general. When we just think about law, we think that law should preempt our reasons, our underlying reasons, and should give us new reasons. However, normal justification thesis is piecemeal. It is only context-specific, and in every contextual situation, we should justify normal justification thesis. So, preemption thesis is addressed, seems like at least for me, to address to individuals. On the other hand, normal justification thesis seems like it is addressed to authoritative institutions. So, preemption thesis assumes a deliberative first-person point of view, whereas normal justification thesis presuppose a theoretical third-person point of view. So, norm subjects are precluded from deliberation, at least substantive deliberation, but they have still have the competence of procedural deliberation. But the legitimacy of authority may be questioned from a third-person point of view. And this is my thesis. This is the dual aspect thesis, at least this is what I call it. Authority has two different dimensions, every kind of authority. And from the perspective of norm subjects, it prevents deliberation. From the perspective of authoritative institutions, it imposes an obligation to increase their legitimacy and assist the subjects in their compliance with their background reasons. So we can just think that normal justification thesis is addressed to authoritative institutions, and authoritative institutions is under the obligation to provide the conditions of normal justification thesis, or they should increase their legitimacy level. But preemption thesis, on the other hand, is addressed to individuals, and individuals are banned from questioning whether I should obey the rule or not, because this is the main function of rule from a legal positivistic point of view. They should be obeyed no matter what it is. But of course, I'm going here more a procedural perspective, because on the other hand, authoritative institutions are under the obligation to increase their legitimacy. So there is this kind of a relationship between authorities and norm subjects. Authoritative institutions are under the duty to provide justification, which gives norm subject a right to justification. When this relationship between subject and authority is transferred to interinstitutional context, we have a problem like domestic analogy in international law. Because from the perspective of monist account of last service conception of authority, we have multiple authorities, and authorities are deferring each other. And when we just transfer this understanding of interinstitutional allocation of authority to international law or other legal orders, which is not monistic, there will always this kind of a problem, whether deferring authority is deferring to another authority for the sake of individuals or not, whether the relationship between deferring authority and deferred authority is the same in the domestic legal order between subject and authority, because of course it's counterintuitive to think like that, to say that, okay, deferring authority is showing deference to deferred authority, and that's why he cannot question the underlying reasons, he cannot question the rule. So there is this kind of a preemptive thesis between authoritative institutions. So it is counterintuitive to think like that. And I will argue that we can just think EU as a monist legal order, at least for now. No need to think in a more complex way. And we can just think that authorities generally are responsible against individuals, and these authorities are European Court of Justice, Bundesverfassungsgericht, both EU and domestic legal orders. And the questions are the same. Who is the subject of authority? At least for the EU, it is individual. But if we just think it in a more expansive or pluralist way, or if we just consider the international legal order, there may be some situations that states may be the subject of international law, and states and individuals may be together subject of international law or some international institutions. This will always depend on the situation. is the beneficiaries of authority? The beneficiaries of authority is at least for now will be individuals in the EU legal order, but there are some scholars such as Besson and Waldron, and they argue that individuals are the subjects even in international legal order rather than states. And in this case, states will be like administrative agencies helping international organizations in favor of individuals. Of course, these have some problems, especially it may lead to cosmopolitanism and cosmopolitan understanding of a global legal order, maybe. Also, does deferring authority is prevented from questioning the decisions of deferred authority? Of course not, because both deferring and deferred authority is collectively responsible against individuals. Since relationship is not between authoritative institutions, but between individuals and authorities, we can say that authorities are collectively responsible towards individuals. Marmor and Rokan provide or give a similar answer here with me. As I said, it is much more complicated in international realm and less integrated regimes. One of the reasons is a problem called identity problem, because RAS Service Conception Authority does not give an answer to the question of who is the authority. It assumes that a domestic legal order or last instance court or any authoritative institution in the monistic legal order is the authority. So there is not an answer of RAS to the question of who is the authority in a pluralistic legal order or international legal order. So it is designed for domestic legal order and suffers the problem of identity. And that's why which authority is legitimate? So no need to deal with at least this identity problem. I'm just showing it. I'm just pointing to this issue to show that there may be some problematic situations in international legal order. And I'm just, at least you can see in the slides that there are some examples in climate change regime or other kind of situations. And in all these kind of situations that states and international organizations conflict or comes together or comes into conflict, we have to ask the question, who are the representatives of individuals in every concrete situations? And of course, Raukan in his book, in her fabulous book, gives a lot of example about these kind of issues, and we can just deal this part maybe later in the Q&A. So the right to justification, which is a right imposed a collective duty on the authoritative institutions, can be used in this context. So I'm here saying that with rules comes the right to justification. If I'm obeying the authority, authorities are under the obligation to provide justification, and individuals have this kind of a right to justification, at least question the rules, procedural aspects, not substantive aspect, of course. When it comes to the PSPP judgment, we can just think PSPP judgment as a chain of balancing. On the first, in the first step, European Central Bank gives a decision about PSPP. Then later, Court of Justice have a ruling on the PSPP. Then Bundesverfassungsgericht has a decision not only about PSPP but also about the other decisions. And the question is that whether individuals or Bundesverfassungsgericht as the representative of German citizens have a right to justification, and or we can just think like that, Bundesverfassungsgericht and Court of Justice have a collective right to provide a justification to the German citizens or EU citizens concerning the PSPP decision. And in PSPP, Bundesverfassungsgericht hold the view that ECB and Court of Justice or the EU institutions are under the responsibility of providing a justification. And they at least have to show us how they are balancing competing rights. These competing rights are, competing principles are economic policies and monetary policies, because every kind of monetary policy will have an effect on economic policy, and at least the ECB and Court of Justice are under the responsibility of how they are striking a balance, these kind of two different rights. Because any kind of balance that you strike between these two competing principles will have a direct impact on the competence issue. Because as you also in Article 5 and Article 127 of the TEU, the monetary policies are under the competences of the EU institutions, but economic policies are under the competences of member states. So at least member states have this kind of a right to justification and to ask for a clarification from the EU institutions whether they strike balance in a proper way, whether they are, at least they have a right to ask for a clarification, whether the balance are struck correctly or not. Also, you can see here some excerpts from the PSPP judgment. And the Bundesverfassungsgericht's main argument is the following. At least the court should show us the balancing step, because in neither ECB's decision or Court of Justice ruling, there is no balancing. And so we cannot understand whether there is an infringement with respect to competences or not without seeing any kind of balancing exercise. What the Bundesverfassungsgericht asked for in the PSPP judgment is clarification as to how the ECJ applied proportional analysis, striking a balance between economic and monetary policies by weighting the cost incurred by economic policies on fiscal policies with the benefits gained from the pursuant policy. It is nothing more than the right to justification, in other words. It demands clarification and explanation concerning how the rule is implemented, whether it is still used in accordance with its jurisdictional and substantial limitations. So the court does not ask for one right answer, and it is using its right to justification. This is the end of my presentation, and thank you very much for listening to me. I know that it is really burdensome. Thank you.